Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Deeran. I'm the director of Enlighten, and welcome to today's event. I'd say our guest today, for an engaged audience like this, barely needs an introduction, but of course he has to receive one. Professor Sir Anton Muscatelli, as you'll know, was until recently the long-serving principal of the University of Glasgow and is now president of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, amongst other things. I have to say, Anton, I don't quite know what your next job might be unless it's to be elected Pope of Scottish academia, which, given your background, might be appealing. But the reason we're here today is that in February this year, Anton was commissioned by Anas Sarwar, leader of Scottish Labour, to explore how Scotland can unlock the potential of its regional economies and ensure that economic growth improves the quality of life of people living across Scotland. That report came out last month, and it is, as you'd expect from someone of the author's calibre, detailed, comprehensive, thoughtful, and rigorous. We know that his findings will be of huge interest to the Enlightened audience. We've had actually more than 140 acceptances for today, which is huge. And so we are delighted to have Anton here with us today. We're going to start with some remarks from Anton before he and I have a chat, and then we'll be taking questions from the audience. So please submit your questions using the Zoom chat box and get them coming in as quickly as you can, so that we can take as many as we can before the end. So as I say, we're delighted to have you here, Anton, and I'm just going to pass over to you for your opening remarks.
Thanks, Chris. And as I said, when the report was launched, the report is about how Scotland can reignite economic growth and spread it hopefully more evenly across the country. And it's about giving people in every part of Scotland the chance to benefit from opportunity and prosperity. And I genuinely think that in Scotland, we've probably focused less than we should on the importance of economic growth. And economic growth matters because, obviously it funds our public services, it supports good jobs, it raises living standards. And indeed, as the report highlights, for quite some time now, devolved policymaking hasn't really placed economic growth at the centre of the policy agenda. And I'm sure we'll go into some of that, the reasons behind that. In fact, just last week, I gave a lecture in London at the National Institute for Economic and Social Research on devolution after 25 years. And one of the things that really struck me as I was delivering that talk is that as Scotland gained more powers, more fiscal powers as a result of the 2012 and 2016 Scotland Acts, the hope had been that with the greater devolved spending powers of devolution would come greater financial fiscal accountability to the electorate. And I genuinely think that accountability hasn't manifested itself in active political debate. So, we now have the additional and more progressive taxes in Scotland, which, of course, ostensibly are there to pay for better public services. That's why people have voted for governments that have brought them in. But in reality, a substantial proportion of those additional taxes have been lost because Scotland's growth has lagged the rest of the UK, and the money has essentially been lost through the fiscal framework. So what I hope as a result of the report being published is that hopefully there will be a debate about public services in the next Holyrood elections. I'd be surprised if there wasn't. And part of that debate can't just be about where we spend our money, but also about how we grow the cake available to pay for those public services. Now, Chris, obviously I can't go into all of the report in 5 minutes. I won't. I hope people have had a chance to read it. There are many recommendations in there, about 50 of them, so quite plenty of us for us to discuss. Not incidentally all directed to the Scottish Parliament and government. Some of them are also directed essentially to UK government in areas where I think we can improve on the UK government's growth mission. For instance, there are recommendations around how R&D taxes work out, how we can look at issues of skilled migration, which clearly are reserve powers. One point I did want to emphasize is that it's not straightforward to make the shift for focusing on growth without putting it at the center of all policymaking decisions. Hence the final chapter recommendations on creating a cabinet subcommittee chaired by the First Minister to oversee this effort. Because to put growth at the center of the economic decision-making agenda really requires a focus on many moving parts, and hence the number of recommendations in the report. And that means, for instance, that the economic and industrial strategy must be brought into the heart of government. It has to be more focused, it has to be more coordinated, it has to be more accountable. Economic policy can't just sit on the sidelines, it has to shape every major decision we make. And finally, just before I stop, Chris, another central theme of the report is devolution and cooperation within Scotland, i.e. devolution from Edinburgh to the regions of Scotland, and indeed across the UK, collaboration and cooperation. We often talk about devolution from Westminster to Holyrood, but much less about what happens beyond that. And too many economic decisions are still taken at the centre in Scotland, while city regions and regional economic partnerships, which I put at the heart of that part of placemaking in my report, lack the powers and resources to shape their futures. Stronger regional decision making, I think, has to be part of that modern growth strategy. And if you have read the report, you'll see very much that focus in place, not on changing the structure of local authorities in Scotland, incidentally, because that would be quite a hard wiring exercise, but really enhancing cooperation through existing regional economic partnerships. And some of these have already got enhanced capabilities, but also with a strong partnership between different regional entities in Scotland and Scottish Government around economic development. So this is not about reproducing what England is doing around strategic authorities or combined mayoral authorities. And absolutely, finally, the report does require greater joint working between Scottish and UK governments. And this is, of course, I think, crucial in areas like net zero. We've seen that, some of the issues around that. But it's also crucial in regional economic development. Again, I mentioned this talk I gave last week about devolution after 25 years. And on reflection, many of the architects of devolution, and it was interesting, there was a few people in the room who'd worked on that original chapter of devolution. I don't think they imagined there would be the need for areas of overlapping competence in areas such as economic and industrial strategy, as well as research and innovation. And so in producing back in 1999 a model which with fully reserved and fully devolved powers, we perhaps didn't fully specify how cooperation would work in these important areas of overlapping policy. And I think that's one of the issues going forward as well. So let me stop there, Chris.
Yeah, well, thanks for those opening remarks, Anton. You mentioned, as we all do these days, but in your report, you mentioned the projections from the Scottish Fiscal Commission and some of the reports that come out from Audit Scotland. And I think all of us who read them are growing more and more alarmed about what the predictions are for the future of Scotland. We know that the gap between what we spend and what we bring in is set to grow. We know that our population is aging faster than elsewhere in the UK. Perhaps for the next couple of years, we can just about get away with it. But in the years after that, it looks like we're heading into a pretty major fiscal crisis. You're obviously an eminent economist. Could you just give us your thoughts on the state of play there?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I do hope those figures from the Scottish Fiscal Commission that were published at the end of last summer are part of the debate. They have to be part of the debate in the run-up to Holyrood election. So, as you say, what these figures do is they compare the resources available to the Scottish Parliament, to the Scottish Government, and compare it to the projected spend given the direction of travel on those key public services from health to education. And you're looking essentially at about $1 billion of a shortfall in 26-27, financial year 26-27. But by the time you get to 29-30, it's about a 4.7 billion shortfall. So in other words, steady as she goes will simply not work around by the time you get to 29-30. Now, of course, some of those figures may change because, the figures around UK spending reviews might change. However, I think there are some really difficult issues there. Actually, what makes it even more politically difficult is that if you look at the figures for 26-27, the shortfall, as I said, is less than by the time you get to 29-30. But also there's some positive uplift likely as a result of the latest budget. And as a result of the fact that I think I'm right in saying that HMRC's latest calculations of tax resources raised associated with Scottish income tax, devolved income taxes, will actually give a bit of an uplift to the Scottish budget. So the danger is that you get into the 26 May elections with everybody saying, well, everything's fine. Here's a little bit more money for X, here's a little more money for Y. And we just ignore that fiscal chasm that's going to hit us in 2, 3, 4 years' time. So I really, really hope the political parties go into this election saying how they're going to deal with the chasm, not how the fact that the crack for next year has been papered over. That's my big concern, I think, at the moment.
And obviously, we'd all love it if we could grow the economy to the scale that will fill that chasm. if you like, but I think that seems unlikely given where we are at present. So our politics is going to have to change, isn't it? The political debate about what we can and can't do, what the state can and can't do, is going to have to be a slightly tougher conversation with the electorate, and the politicians are going to have to be a bit more realistic. I don't really see any sign of that yet, which going into the election, as you say, the concern is that there is still some complacency, and they will, being politicians, their incentive is to promise more, always more, but actually we are heading for a cliff edge. So what do you think, how do we get to the point where we are having the political debate that we all know we need to have? We're not the politicians, so it's easy for us to say, but we are going to have to get there.
Well, I think the answer has to be that organizations like Enlighten and other organizations occupy the space. There I say also the organization I currently head, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, in the run-up to the election, will have to ask political parties to address what are they going to do with the big, these big trends: health, education. How are they going to deal with the fact that we will have, in real terms, we won't have the resources that we would like to have in order to maintain current levels of spend or current levels of benefit. And you've seen that to some extent in health recently, how the NHS, both in Scotland and the rest of the UK, has had to deal with additional pressures. So I'm kind of hoping that our organizations will perhaps hold politicians to account, and we can have some engaged debates around what can we afford, where does there have to be more of a private contribution, how do we deal with the issue that we have a partially devolved tax system, but one that also interacts in an awkward way with the rest of the UK as well, because we saw recently, just to conclude this point, in the run-up to the UK budget, that there are certain configurations of what might have happened there around national insurance and income tax proposals that might have actually had different impacts in Scotland. So really complicated issues there.
Yeah. So you talked about how economic development has become much less of a priority in the Scottish policy debate over the years. I remember when I started out as a young journalist, it was the main thing that we talked about, actually, apart from devolution, obviously, and independence. But economic development felt like a much livelier issue. What happened? Why did we stop thinking as hard about it?
It's a great question. I don't know. I suspect you probably need a political scientist to analyze this rather than an economist. But it's interesting. When as you know, I chaired a technical working group for the Calman Commission that led to the 2012 Scotland Act, and that was completely overtaken in a sense by the 2016 Act, where more powers around taxation were devolved. But as part of that, one of the big themes when we were discussing this with the Calman Commission as a technical working group was, well, look, we've created a spending parliament. We haven't created a parliament that debates how it's going to raise the resources to do that. And that's an important part of accountability. And a lot of the debate was around that. But actually, in reality, we've created quite a complex fiscal framework. Unlike some federal countries, which have a more symmetric model of devolution with, and I know why symmetric model wasn't appropriate in the UK, because, of course, we have these historic nations: Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, not a nation, Northern Ireland in the same sense, but you know what I mean, these historic areas with devolution. When you have a more symmetric model, then you look at all elements of it around how you set up the block grant, how you set up some degree of fiscal devolution. The fiscal framework, even politicians themselves, in my experience, have trouble understanding the fiscal frameworks, let alone the electorate. And I think this is where it gets really complicated, because again, where the rubber hits the road is that we need to grow our economy faster than the rest of the UK, or at least as fast as the rest of the UK, not to lose out from that fiscal framework. Now, you'd think that would generate a political debate around growth, but it hasn't. Now, I don't know the answer to why it hasn't. I suspect it's because it's much more complex than it had been intended. And as a result, we're focusing on spend and benefits as opposed to growth. So, sorry, that's a long answer, but I suspect we've made it complicated.
Okay. I think one of the things that is most intriguing about your report is that it's felt like for a period we've talked about the Scottish economy as being one whole thing. And actually it's become clear, and maybe you use the word place, but that's becoming a very fashionable word now in policy circles, to think a bit more about the different needs and the different challenges and opportunities that different parts of Scotland have. So if you're in Aberdeen, you've obviously got the energy transition. If you're in Glasgow, you've got retail issues and other issues there. Edinburgh has its own challenges. We were in Dundee last week, where there's a great civic appetite to take control there of their own economic and policy future as well. Just talk a bit about that economic performance being far from uniform, as you say in your report. Drops in productivity levels, regional inequalities within Scotland, etc. I'm sure you were aware of all this before you started your report, but what did you find when you were investigating?
So I was aware of some of it, but actually it's quite interesting. There is a graph in the report actually, which unfortunately has a legend missing. I mean, as ever, you always discover a typo at some point, but it's on, for those of you who have a chance to look at the report, it's on page 5, it's figure 1.2, and it shows productivity levels in the different regional economies in Scotland. Now, even though the legend is missing, you can, by following the footnote, you can find it. And what it shows is effectively, with the exception of Edinburgh City Region or East Central Scotland in the nomenclature used in the UK classification, which has seen an increase in productivity, and possibly to a lesser extent Glasgow City Region has seen an improvement in productivity, although not to the same extent as Edinburgh City Region. With that exception, you're seeing divergence there. And you mentioned the North East, and of course the North East is dealing with a major industrial transition at the moment with the move away from oil and gas. And that's fared particularly poorly in terms of not only productivity, but also actually, as we know recently, in jobs and growth. So you're seeing a divergence, not a convergence. And that is a problem. And then you put that together with Scotland's growth since, in the last 20 years or so, and it hasn't really kept pace, certainly with parts of the UK that have grown faster. And so both of these things, greater divergence within Scotland and slower growth in Scotland itself is clearly creating pressures.
Yeah, and I think in some of the conversations that you had when you were writing your report, you say that an issue is often raised is whether Scotland has the policy tools at its disposal to deploy an effective regional economic development policy. And you say that it has many policy tools at its disposal. Whether we've been using them properly or thinking about them hard enough is another question. But I think you say a recent study by leading economists, including the former chief economic advisor in the Scottish government, has suggested that a lot of the changes over the 25 years since devolution have been presentational rather than substantial.
Yeah, absolutely. The study, Chris, you're referring to is one which was done by Andrew Gowdy together with who's currently at the University of Strathclyde, together with two colleagues at the University of Glasgow, Graham Roy and David Waite, and they've interviewed a lot of those involved in policymaking during those years, those involved with enterprise agencies, those involved in government, and basically a lot of the conclusions are exactly that. That a lot of the changes have been presentational as opposed to real. And then you look at the amount that has been spent in Scotland on regionally on economic development generally through the enterprise agencies, but also directly, and that's difficult to track, to be honest, because interventions have been done separately. But if you just focus on the amount spent through the enterprise agencies, that's declined in real terms. Now, some of that is not surprising. If you're going to protect areas of spend like health and school education, then we've seen this in the UK as well. You end up spending less pretty much on everything else. But it does mean it's not just about spending money. It's also about, as you say, focus. And one of the areas, I suppose, that's been a bit disappointing for me, having been involved at the outset with the National Strategy for Economic Transformation and the advisory board there, I thought we were going to see that as a refocus on growth. And instead, it hasn't been that. It's been, well, let's look at all the things we're doing, and let's, we have, several pillars, many objectives. I think that exemplifies this issue that growth is there in the background, but it's always as one of many issues that we're trying to address. And I'm trying to, through the report, I was trying to kind of emphasize that it's probably the primary thing, because without that, we don't pay anything. We can't pay for anything.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And as a supplementary to that, really, is that you talk about the working together at a Holyrood level, but also at a Westminster level for policy interventions, where you will achieve more if you can coordinate what you're doing, so that there's not an overlap, there's not unnecessary repetition. You talk about across OECD countries where major policy levers are reserved at national level and some are devolved, and the key is how devolved policy can best complement national policy.
Totally, totally. And actually, I again, I was speaking recently to somebody who was involved in the drafting of that 1998 legislation that led to the Parliament. I and this person said to me that it was never imagined that coordination would be a problem between governments. But then, of course, along came big shocks like Brexit and COVID, and we saw that during those, relationships were pretty poor between Scottish and Westminster government. I suppose what I'm saying, and again in the report, is that that can't be the case. Because if, and you cannot have an industrial strategy for the UK without Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And similarly, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland cannot have an industrial strategy which is not coordinated with England. That makes absolutely no sense. And if we were in Germany at the moment, we wouldn't be having these debates. And this is I think one of the key issues for me.
Yeah, I'd like to move on to sort of local devolution, which you have a section on in the paper, and it feels a subject of increasing interest and importance as well in terms of what it can deliver around the areas that you're talking about. I mean, we all talk about Greater Manchester and the impact that the combined authority is having there. We haven't seen the same devolution at a Scottish level. In fact, we've probably seen more centralisation since Holyrood came along, but the impact of, I suppose, when you look at Scottish local government, the pressures on them are such that they're not actually all that focused on economic growth. It's not really what they're there to do at the moment. They're there to deliver social services and policy and the rest of it. Whereas the advent of perhaps directly elected mayors or the combined authorities, however you want to describe them, has given this focus to economic development. And we can see in Manchester where they are having interesting outcomes there. It's the one that everyone talks about, but the other examples are available. What's your take on the benefits of greater devolution, of that place-based understanding of freeing people to understand and address their local issues, with giving them the policy levers so that they can actually do so, whether that's transport, planning, or the rest?
So I think it's really important, and I think, as you say, Greater Manchester, I suppose, is the best example of that. And I actually do a graph and present a graph in the report which compares Greater Manchester with Glasgow, and actually there's no difference in terms of trends and productivity between Glasgow City Region and Greater Manchester. But Greater Manchester has grown faster. It's managed to grow its population faster. It's grown its inward investment faster. So it's not a productivity effect; it's a growth effect. And now, to be fair, not every combined mayoral authority in England has performed as well as Greater Manchester, and so that is the exemplar. West Midlands is a good example as well. And to be fair, also, again, if you're looking at regional economic partnerships in Scotland, some of them, like Edinburgh City Region and Glasgow City Regions, have grown their capacity for looking at economic development much better than others. They, with the hollowing out of capacity for planning and economic development and local government, actually, I'm less worried about Glasgow City Region, Edinburgh City Region. I'm more worried about the other ones. But the point is this, that you're absolutely right. I think there needs to be a move away from that centralization. It's actually heartening to hear actually several political parties talking about that just now. I hope it does get delivered, because I think it's really important. Now, I would say one more thing, however. I think capacity still has to grow, even in the best regional economic partnerships in Scotland, because even in areas like Glasgow and Edinburgh, that capacity needs to be there. At the moment, they've had to handle things like city deals, like investment zones, and we can talk about some of those because some of them have been more successful than others. But if we do more, even more, if you want to do more around planning and around even more devolved spending, then their capacity will have to improve even further, their capacity for planning. And I think this is a key thing in the report. We also need to work them together, because, one thing that's different about the geography of Scotland compared to that of England is the fact that actually, Glasgow City region, Edinburgh City region, Tayside are actually very close to one another geographically. So the notion that they're simply going to go and do their own stuff without coordination at Scottish government level is crazy. So Scottish government would need to push more powers out to these regional economic partnerships, but also hold the ring between them and get them to collaborate. A life sciences strategy doesn't make sense unless it's cooperative between these three city regions in the Central Belt. It would be insane to basically say, go off and do your own stuff. So, you see what I mean? It's actually, it's pushing out, but also holding the ring. And that is, again, is the bandwidth within government to allow that to happen as opposed to focusing on many, many things.
And you talk about the Golden Triangle in the south of Oxford, Cambridge, and London, and you suggest that Glasgow and Edinburgh should be presented as a joint investable prospect rather than as two competing centres.
Totally. And if you look at the level of investment that you need to be competitive in areas like life sciences and biomedicine and quantum technologies, there's no way that Edinburgh and Glasgow should be competing against each other in this space. They should be working together because otherwise, frankly, they stand no chance against the Oxford-Cambridge arc, as I say in my report. Or indeed, if you're looking at quantum and semiconductor compared to the zone between Oxford, Bristol, and Southampton, there's no way you could compete unless we work together across these two cities and indeed beyond those two cities.
Thinking about the enterprise agencies, which is another area that you look at, and certainly I'm sure you hear this as well. In fact, you talk about this. You say that when talking about Scottish enterprise, those companies that have been invested in by Scottish enterprise are unsurprisingly quite positive, and those who didn't get investment are quite negative. Certainly, I was quite surprised by your view of Scottish enterprises. It was probably quite a more positive view than I thought, given the conversations I've had with business, although it may be the fact that I'm speaking to people who weren't invested in as well. But can you talk to us a bit about, because if we're talking about regional development and you've got SOCI and you've got HIE and then you've got Scottish enterprise dealing with everything else, is that set up the right one for a Scotland of the mid-21st century?
I think I didn't suggest any change to that simply because I do recognize that, as you said in the report, that rural economic development has different requirements. So what SOSI and HIE have to do is inherently different from what SE, which in a sense is also responsible for the whole of Scotland, particularly in the international sphere, has to do. Now, that, to be fair, I didn't do a deep dive into all three to look at their efficiency, effectiveness. In fact, as you know in the report, I said, look, Parliament should look at the effectiveness of spend in these three agencies compared to best in class across Europe. So that's one recommendation. But I think that architecture is okay. The one thing I emphasize, which I think is important, is that, again, strategy on economic development should reside within government. These agencies and other NDPBs connected to regional economic development should be at that table. But they should be delivery agencies, and that's what they should be held accountable for, delivering of a strategy that is determined within government. At the moment, I still think there's a bit of, it's a bit vague as to how much of it they're focused on delivery and how much they're focused on strategy. And that is actually one of the, I think that's where some of the confusion comes out. But as you say, it's more positive because actually when you speak to companies, high growth companies that have been supported, they feel very positive about it because they've been, they're amongst the select group that have been supported. And especially those who have had help in terms of FDI, some of them have helped and had help with export markets. They speak very positively their experience with SE and SDI.
But we have a problem in Scotland with accessing money for our investment for scaling up, so taking it from concept through to production and then growth. And you touch on that. Why do you think it is such a difficulty? We've obviously got SNIB now who are able to invest in certain mission-led projects. There are angel investors, as you touch on as well, but there is a huge gap at other levels.
Well, I think it's the quantum and sometimes it's bandwidth. And by the way, we're not alone. So if we were having this conversation in the north, even in the northwest of England, which we've just talked about is doing well, actually, you look at the sort of funds that have been set up, like Northern Gritstone, they've done very well, but the quantum is not huge compared to the needs of a scale up. So to some extent, we're still, this is a UK-wide problem still, and which is why, as you know, there's been debates within Treasury, there's been engagement with pension funds to try and create a scale-up environment. So there's different elements. So both UK and Scottish government actually have done well in terms of creating more proof of concept funding, because to be honest, without that initial funding, particularly in that initial phase of innovation, you're not going to get anywhere. And so it's important that we invest several, funds of several million simply to fund these promising companies. But as you say, then quickly you get into scale ups, and I think the only answer for the UK, to be honest, is going to be around mobilizing pension funds, because we simply pale into significance compared to what is happening in North America. Now, SNIB, actually, just since you mentioned it, actually some very positive responses I got from business around the role of the investment bank, where initially, of course, it had to find its role, but some really positive feedback as well around how it had adapted. And actually, compared to many of these agencies in this space, it had adapted, for instance, by working together with the other agencies. And there's a chapter in there which talks how it works with the National Wealth Fund and etc. And it had, it set up MOUs with these other organizations to make sure that they don't step on each other's toes. So all of that actually is working quite well. But to be honest, if we really want as a UK to operate more around scale up, we need to carry out what was set out in those discussions around pension funds, and that needs to be delivered on in order to create the funding. It's a UK-wide issue.
Yeah, okay. Higher and further education and skills, obviously an area of great interest to you throughout your career, and central to this paper, and I think central to the conversations we're all having about improving economic growth and productivity. We know that, and you've spoken about this in the past, as have other vice principals, etc., that the sector is not in great financial health at present. We all saw what happened to Dundee. We know that Edinburgh's cutting jobs. Lots of our colleges are in trouble. There is an existential threat, as I think you call it, facing some of those further down the line, maybe not so far down the line. But if they are so central to our prospects, our economic prospects, then we're going to have to get a grip of this situation. And I wonder if you could just talk to us about your sort of view of what it is that needs to be done to get things back in an even keel and allow them to prosper and compete against the best in the world, which they do, but a bit with one hand tied behind their back at the moment.
Yeah, it's a really complicated area, and as you say, the figures on sustainability that the Scottish Funding Council have produced on both colleges and universities actually highlight that. It looks worse for colleges than it does for universities in those sustainability reports, but only because there tends to be a bit of an optimism bias around university projections anyway, because most universities tend to project some income growth and cost control, which actually I think has some optimism bias built in. So what I've said, the reason I've said this is because I think it's the realpolitik around it. I've suggested that there should be a fully independent review of the tertiary sector post-Holyrood election. And the reason I say post-Holyrood election is because you don't have the time to do it before. And frankly, you'd never get agreement between the parties to empower such a review. It has to, in my view, because of how difficult the debates have been around funding in Scotland and how totemic some of these things have been, I don't think you should start with funding. I think you should start with the question of what is the right shape and size of the sector, because we know that the shape and size of the sector, and not only in Scotland, but frankly in England and Wales and Northern Ireland as well, will change over time. The external environment is changing in terms of funding. UKRI is becoming more selective in what it will fund. We saw that in the UK government's white paper. The international market for students is becoming much tighter, because rather than 5 big Anglophone countries competing for the large growth in international students, there's around 14, 15 countries that are competing in that space at the moment, and more will be added. So you start with the shape and size of the sector and what does Scotland need, and how many research intensive universities might it need in future, how many colleges. Is there something in that space? Do we need more differentiated missions, both within the college and university sector? You start with all the difficult stuff. And then at the end, you come up with, well, what is the funding model? You know, do we need to find different ways of funding higher education? But if you start with a final one, we never get anywhere because it's so totemic. I think you begin with the shape and size. And frankly, again, going back to the last major shakeup in tertiary education back in, I suppose, 2011, 2012, when the decision was made to put more public funding in and keep higher education free and colleges were merged, that was a genuine discussion about what should the right shape and size be of the sector. Now, you can argue as to whether it was right or not, but that was a big decision. And then there was a decision to fund it publicly, and the money was found to put in back in 2011-12 to say, well, we do not want to introduce fees in Scotland. Therefore, here is the quantum that's required in order for it to remain competitive. But that funding bit was the last of, was a piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't the only piece of the puzzle. There are other pieces in this puzzle, and that's what I'd like to focus on as well.
I think it was quite reassuring to see someone with a sort of a background in the university sector talking or giving colleges their place, and obviously looking at a more regional approach, that colleges are very often more rooted in the areas that they represent. They're often educating people maybe from less privileged backgrounds. They are providing apprenticeships, skills training, not just for people who've just left school, but lifelong learning. Whatever happened to that is a phrase that we used to use all the time. We don't hear that so much anymore. Again, just be interested to hear your take on the importance of colleges, and we know that they're underfunded. We know that they are having all sorts of problems that a lot of them might not survive. But how central are they to what you're talking about achieving in this report?
I think they are really central to this report, and it's not surprising to see that emphasis on college education, as I say, not only in Scotland, but also in the UK white paper as well. There are skills mismatches. We know that. I mean, we know that there's areas of skills shortage. We recently saw that around shipbuilding in Scotland. So look, at the end of the day, this is also about what proportion of our young population should go into FE or HE. It should also be about lifelong learning as well, because one of the things we know is going to change over the next few years, particularly as technological change accelerates, is also we need retraining and we need reskilling. Now, and colleges are good at that. I mean, that's essentially, a lot of them are set up exactly for that. But some of what they do needs to be reoriented. And again, there's a question as to whether they should be more FEHE collaboration. There's a lot of that in Scotland already. And actually, Scotland does better than many other parts of the UK in that front. But again, what's the funding mechanism to incentivize them all to do that? I was speaking to the leader of one Scottish university that will remain nameless in recent months, and they were saying they would like to do much more in that apprenticeship space, working with colleges and working in that graduate apprenticeship space, but the funding doesn't incentivize them to do that. And so there's many issues here around how we can really improve the standing of colleges and how can we make the whole tertiary system much more coherent.
There's so much more I want to ask you, but I'm aware of the time and I do want to get the audience involved. So I'm just going to run through a few questions. The first one's from Nick Wright, who says, with 50 recommendations, it's clear that a comprehensive approach and much effort are needed. What should the initial priorities for action be?
That's a great question. I think, as I said in the final chapter, what I would recommend an incoming government should do is certainly set up that cabinet subcommittee headed by the First Minister, not something you delegate to your Minister for the Economy. Absolutely central, I think. Have find a way of involving the key NDPBs around the table, the enterprise agencies, Scottish Funding Council, etc. But also how you convene the regional economic partnerships and how you deal with the capacity that some of them don't have to try and engage in that economic development space. So those, I think, the architecture first. I would start with that, and then other things can work in parallel. The recommendations to the UK government, frankly, are there now, and there are things that the UK government should also be doing around that economic growth space in terms of pulling levers. So, some of those things can proceed in parallel, but those are, I think I would start with the architecture.
Okay. John McNally, who I suspect is my uncle John McNally, but I'm not giving him favourable treatment. It's just an interesting question. Says, as energy is a reserved matter, would devolving energy policy decisions to Scotland develop inward investment, more jobs, cheaper, more affordable energy prices to households and businesses, and certainty of policy would result in certainty of investment and natural progressive growth?
I think, frankly, greater cooperation between UK and Scottish government is key in this whole area of energy policy. Again, it's one of those areas where without close partnership, frankly, transition is going to be really, really, well, it's difficult as it is, let alone if there isn't any partnership. I think, as I highlighted earlier, one of the problems of making something devolved or reserved is that it's a 0-1 option and it doesn't work. I think with something like energy policy, I think it's fine for it to remain reserved, but there needs to be genuine engagement by UK government with the across the four nations, and frankly with the strategic authorities as they develop across England to try and deal with big investments in infrastructure. I mean, one thing we didn't touch on, but if you look at the Scottish Fiscal Commission, you look at the fiscal burden potentially of some of those infrastructure investments around net zero mitigation. This is not energy policy, but this is the mitigation area. And Scotland has potentially huge issues there. And so again, a collaborative approach is absolutely essential there.
Okay. Sam Taylor, still on energy, do you think politicians understand the implications of an energy transition, which is a transition from high return on capital businesses, oil and gas, to low return on capital businesses, renewables?
No, I agree with Sam. I don't think politicians understand that. And I think Sam's done actually quite a lot recently in highlighting just how difficult it can be. By focusing on the fact that we need to have a transition in order to survive as humanity on the planet, and highlighting the fact that there will be benefits as well as costs. We've sometimes, I think, ignored the fact that it's more difficult because of that's one of he highlights one of the issues. It's much more difficult than we thought. But you're right, it's exactly that. Let me just leave it at that. I think Sam is correct.
Is there a problem, though, with the rhetoric that this debate has involved in Scotland? Because you can look at what's happening at Westminster and across actually other parts of the world where there is a new realism, perhaps, about net zero and whatever. But as ever in Scotland, we have tried very hard to be the good guys, or to present ourselves as the good guys, and in a sense, we end up trapping ourselves in a bit of a corner on these things.
Yeah, although we shouldn't beat ourselves up, it's also happening because of other pressures. It's partly because of some of the external pressures. I was just noticing at the weekend that Mark Carney, and I couldn't be a bigger advocate of transition than he was when he was at the Bank of England, even talking about these issues as a policymaker, and he's having to pull some policy levers that go in the opposite direction as Canada comes under pressure because of what's happening around increased protectionism. So I'm not surprised in seeing, a number of governments around the world saying, as the external environment worsens, basically saying, my goodness, can we afford this, or will this be palatable to our electorates? So that's what we're seeing at the moment. So I wouldn't beat ourselves up too much.
Okay. I see Roy Leckie has his hand up. Roy, do you want to ask the question?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And Anton. So just a quick question on kilts.
Oh, yes.
Is this a giant gimmick, or is this an opportunity for a sort of good source of medium, long-term funding if allocated properly? And is it going to be of a scale that's going to be relevant? So just any thoughts there, Anton? Thank you.
Thanks, Roy. Although you're I think you would be more of an expert on this than I would, but let me give you my take. Actually, it's funny. I was asked this by a financial journalist. So the scale of this means it's not really that significant. We're talking, I think, the initial tranche is around 200, 300 million, isn't it? And of course, the borrowing powers of Scottish Parliament are actually quite small. And it's actually quite interesting because I was being asked the question of why it's been given the same sovereign rating as the UK, because we know that in quite a lot of sub-sovereign bond issues tend to have worse ratings. To be honest, I think it's simply because there is in the UK's case, it's because there is an implicit guarantee there anyway, and because the fiscal framework's pretty tight on borrowing, and that's why we've been given that. Most of the people I've spoken to suggest there still be some kind of premium of the order of 20 to 60, 80 basis points. And if that's the case, then it is little more than a bit of decoration around this. It's not significant in the sense that it shows, it doesn't show anything about what an independent Scotland, for instance. I mean, if that's, some people have tried to turn this into a debate about independence and debt. I mean, it isn't. This is sub-sovereign debt, and it's the same rating as the rest of the UK because it's highly controlled. And yeah, it's more expensive to Scotland than going through the debt management agency. But hey, that's where it is. It's just a way of branding Scotland, I suspect. And there's a small price attached to it.
Hugh Morris says the European politician Jean-Claude Juncker once said, "We all know what to do, but we don't know how to get re-elected once we've done it."
Yeah.
This view has been echoed more recently by politicians in the devolved nations of the UK have said they won't talk about difficult choices because we will become individually unpopular, affecting our personal or party fortunes. Are there any ways out of this trap? That's a big question.
Well, that's a great question, and I think you'd need to speak to political scientists. And we saw actually a lot of this even in the run-up to the UK election, where a lot of the issues around taxes, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies pointed out, were completely buried by, the main parties. So yeah, it is an issue. I'll go back to what I said earlier in my response to Chris. I think we in civic society have a responsibility not to let politicians get away with it. I think if we end up with a debate in the run-up to the Holyrood election, which is all about, oh, well, we're going to put another few hundred million into the NHS, and we're going to put a few more, a couple hundred million into higher education, and it's all going to be fine. Frankly, if that's the level of debate, then I think, we civic society should not be letting politicians get away with it.
What about the tax situation? Obviously, income taxes are higher for better off people in Scotland than they are elsewhere in the UK, although perhaps that's changed slightly with the last budget. But where do you stand on the impact that this could be having on Scotland's competitiveness, on the attraction to individuals and inward investment from overseas? And is it something that we should be thinking harder about, or do you think it doesn't have all that much of an impact?
So it's interesting. As part of my report, I certainly heard from companies that were, UK companies, and indeed some companies that have been involved in FDI, that it did kind of influence their decision, and certainly UK companies deciding to what extent their operations in Scotland, were growing relative to the rest of the UK. Because, if you were moving up to Scotland over a certain salary, it meant that you had to be compensated for this. We don't know what the impact has been. There's been a couple of HMRC surveys, as I mentioned in the report. Scottish Fiscal Commission is going to look at all this, but I suspect it'll all be after the election, so it'll be a moot point for the election. But I think the jury's out. But what I say in my report is, look, you need to be cognizant of this. Frankly, at UK level, we've got a problem with taxes. I mean, the FT did a really good piece recently, showing that actually it's in the middle. It's in the middle to high level that we are taxing people, more than other European countries. It's not actually at the very, very, very top of the wealth scale, nor is it at the bottom. So there's some issues there UK level, and then of course the Scottish situation, the Scottish taxes kind of overlay on that. So I think there needs to be some kind of debate around this. But it's a debate not just about taxes; it's also about benefits. And let me finish on one other point, Chris, which is really important. There's a really good book by Paul Johnson which points out that in the really big taxes like VAT, etc., we do not do what other European countries do. We have large loopholes. We could afford to do more around these taxes and compensate those on lower incomes while still actually net doing more through tax reform. So tax reform around integrating national insurance and tax and income tax, around VAT, around doing a proper capital gains reform, which yes, perhaps increases capital gains taxes, but also deals with the issue of inflation and indexation. So all these things, I think, but the problem is, again, that requires major tax reform at UK level before we even come to devolved taxation. So sorry, again, a long reply there.
No, that's good. I think one of the disappointments that most people agree with from Holyrood has been the lack of collaboration, given that the Parliament was explicitly set up and designed in certain ways to encourage that. And your report talks a lot about collaboration between Scotland and UK governments and between Holyrood and local. But Angus Tulloch I think you may or may not have a view in this. Do you think more collegiate working in the Scottish Parliament might be encouraged if seating was arranged randomly by lottery instead of by party affiliation?
I'm probably not an expert on that. I'm not a political scientist, as I say. It might create like less adversarial politics. But I mean, we've seen adversarial politics even seeping down into committee levels. And in theory, committees were supposed to work differently in the Scottish Parliament, and they haven't really recently. They've become much more adversarial. So I suspect it requires party leadership to come together and say, are we going to do this differently? Or are we just going to reproduce what essentially we have in Westminster, which is, that kind of politics? And maybe look, there's another possibility. If you end up with a minority government next time again, which of course we saw in Scotland between 2007 and 2011, maybe that will have to engender greater collaboration, because to some extent what we've seen recently is when you have either a majority or close to a majority or through coalition, makes it really much more naturally more adversarial anyway.
Okay. Now, Alistair Veitch, you have a question that is typically high level, and I wonder if you'd like to ask it yourself, because I'm not sure I fully understand it, but I'm sure you will, and I'm sure Anton will.
Yeah, it wasn't particularly well written. I'm not great at these chat things, so apologies. I guess simplistically, do we have a policy loop that needs to be broken? In as much as there's a lot of uncertainty on the fiscal front for private investment to be justified. I guess the hurdle rate associated with private investment is probably increased quite significantly as a result of the uncertainty on fiscal policy going forward, both either from the taxation and or the spending side. So both sides of that, I guess. And I guess if that is significantly high, the ability for this to be resolved, we can't keep pushing away fiscal clarity, because without it, all the noises that is being made just continues to add to that. And therefore, the one key thing is productivity. And I think your report does mention that first and foremost, I think. And, the real, I guess, elephant in the room is really the fact that the politicians cannot provide that clarity. And how, can you and others, I guess, when you've kind of touched on this, really get that clarity to be forthcoming, to reduce that hurdle rate, to allow productivity to increase, to therefore make the fiscal position better and start to make it a positive loop rather than a negative one?
Yeah, no, I've heard the same, and thank you for that. I mean, and of course, we must also not exaggerate the amount of powers that any devolved government has in this space. Ultimately, this is why it's a UK growth mission, and it has to be very much the UK that has to address this around both clarity in terms of fiscal position, but also in other dimensions as well. I mean, we haven't touched on the whole need to deepen the relationship with Europe. I mean, that's part of the UK government's agenda, but how that's delivered over the next few years will be absolutely crucial given the proximity of Europe, etc. But no, look, I agree. I think one of the lessons in terms of UK macroeconomic policy over the last couple of years is that clarity over the long term is absolutely really important. You've heard CBI talk about it. You've heard other employer organizations. There needs to be real clarity around that, and removing as much uncertainty as possible around major arms of policy. Yeah, so I would agree.
So Anton, sorry, just Chris, if I could just quickly follow up.
Very quickly. Yeah.
Very quickly. So do you believe that we can get productivity growth without that clarity, or are we doomed to failure to get very emotive about the language, I guess?
No, I think we can. Look, uncertainty really is a big drag, but it's not the only thing that has held productivity in the UK up, right? I mean, if you look at what's held it up compared to other OECD countries, and there's been a slowdown across OECD countries, but with us, it's been in part around public investment, and some of that is being certainly put in place over the last couple of years. Some of that is around trade deepening, and I'm afraid some of that work still has to be done. Things around technological diffusion are usually important, and again, what we do around that is important. Planning, absolutely key, and we're still seeing that, some of that going through, UK Parliament, and again, we need to see that clarity, as I say in my report in Scotland. So there are different bits of it. It's not just uncertainty. If uncertainty were to persist because of macroeconomic reasons or because of external environment, it wouldn't stop necessarily all of productivity recovery. It's not the only factor here.
Hey, Paul McLennan, until recently the Housing Minister, asks, what is the role of targeted additional borrowing powers for Scottish Government, brackets housing and infrastructure funding, as part of a more flexible fiscal framework?
Yeah, and it's a really interesting question, Paul. And I think again it's going to be interesting. I'm especially around whether it's housing or net zero investment or indeed research and innovation. I mean, there could be some questions about that. But again, in order to do that, you need greater cooperation between UK and devolved governments. And indeed, one of the things, Graham Roy and I wrote a piece recently around pro-productivity policies, and we talked very much around that. How could you flex the fiscal framework? But it needs to be a UK-wide discussion, and again, a kind of harmonious discussion between the four nations, and indeed more than the four nations, even some of those English CMAs or strategic authorities, around could you think of more investments of that type, which would bridge the reserve-devolved gap? So yeah, no, these could be interesting possibilities. And at the moment, that's not happening. I mean, at the moment, all of the allocations, as you know, going to the Scottish Parliament, with the exception of these interventions like investment zones, etc., have all come through the standard block grant.
Chris, very briefly on that, and I'll come in. There are discussions just to I suppose give you some encouragement, Anton. There are some discussions, for example, around about blind Millsmore area and house developments where the UK and Scottish governments are already talking about that. So there's seeds of that kind of coming through. So that, I think you're quite correct. We need to see more of that, but that's already beginning to happen. But we need to see more. Totally agree.
Totally agree.
We'll probably get time for a couple more questions before we finish. And Colin Mason touches on something that we haven't spoken about, which is business startup and growth in terms of Scotland needing to raise its business startup rate and its business scale-up rate. We need to be discussing how this can happen. We're not great at startups, are we, in Scotland?
No. Although again, as Colin also says in his question, it's also about scale-up as well. Because again, if you want to improve productivity, you also need to look at the tail of productivity. We know that within each sector, there's also a large tail which doesn't help overall productivity. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, and there's different, again, a lot of that is to do with burden on business and regulation. And again, it's something I touch on the report.
Well, one last question, which I think gives us a chance to end on a positive, and you to put some iron in our soul. Jenny Britton says, what unites us in terms of how we want to present ourselves on a global stage in terms of economic growth, innovation, change, equality? So how do we sell Scotland abroad as a united nation as opposed to a divided one, which often is what comes across?
Well, look, and again, we've focused on the negatives, as you say, Chris, and that's a really good question. I think one of the things that, of course, also hopefully comes through in the report is that there are some fantastic examples of both in terms of fast-growing parts of the Scottish economy. We have some incredible startups. I mean, at the University of Glasgow, we've just had a Series B funding on one of our spin-outs, $50 million, which is probably one of the biggest in the UK, frankly, around that whole space of AI and chemistry. So you don't need to be in the Golden Triangle. You don't need to be in California to do this kind of stuff. And so, I would use those exemplars, to really highlight what Scotland can do when it's at its best. Look, even given all the negativity around the external environment, what's happening in the world around protectionism, etc., we can do these things. It's a question about how we can do more. Again, I would really like to see more positive engagement between the political parties about reform, serious reform, ahead of the next election. If we could do that, then that would be a good start.
Okay, well, listen, we're out of time now. I'd really like to thank you, Anton, for giving us your time today, and we're looking forward to seeing what you do with the Royal Society of Edinburgh. I suspect you'll have a significant impact there, as you do with everything that you do. Also, thank you to everyone who attended today. Some really great questions as well, and I think that, this issue is as important as anything we can possibly, is perhaps the most important area to discuss ahead of the Holyrood election and afterwards as well. So we at Enlighten will certainly be returning to it, and I'm sure we will see Anton again before too long to continue this conversation. So thank you very much, everyone.